Welcome. Yes, it is redistricting, and this is what it's all about. I'm Ingrid Reed, and I'm a visiting associate at Eagleton. And this presentation was done in the spring when we were just sort of getting into thinking about redistricting, but it's now being recorded in August. The Census will soon be making its pronouncement about our population, and then in our nation and in New Jersey, we will be thinking about how that new census data requires us to make districts that represent our state fairly. We are a republic, and that's our form of democracy. And therefore, for a republic to work, we have to choose our representatives because we have an agreement that our representatives will run the government for us. So, if you would like to see how it all started, take a look at the first article of the U.S. Constitution, because that's where it says that the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen. And of course, the first go-round, it was new, but then it made the provision to do it every 10 years to make sure that the people we were counting were up to date and would be known to everyone. So that resulted in the beginning of the census. The census is really to determine fairness in the way we set up the areas from which we elect our representatives. Now, we didn't do that for the Senate, as you know, because we started out with 2 senators being selected from each state, in effect by the legislature, but we now elect them. So we're working with a system that's really important to us in our democracy. Now, let me give you a little history, because we will be looking at New Jersey. Every state is special and different. This is a little cartoon that shows New Jersey's not successful, obviously, by the expression on the face of the little New Jersey. And it wasn't little because of the size of the state, but it was a little because it didn't have that much influence. New Jersey and other small states really wanted only a representative government. That is, the House of Representatives being the only house. But Virginia, as you can see, looking powerful, said, no, we need a system where the big states are represented, and we know that the representatives are official and important and so on. So as you can see, we settled on a compromise that we would have both. And New Jersey was joined by Madison and people from other states, such as a man named Elbridge Gerry, who was probably the most deliberate proponent of the Bill of Rights. And that actually happened as the First Amendment to the Constitution to protect the rights of the people who would be selecting the House of Representatives. That is, everyone, all the voters. But I think it's good to pause here and remember that the census counts everybody, and the districts that are created include all people from which we select our representatives, not just voters or citizens or people who are the right age to vote. It's everyone. So that's the basis on which redistricting, that is, considering districts again in light of the census, takes place. Now, in New Jersey, we, of course, were told how many districts we had based on the census. But when it came to our own state, that is our legislature, that arrangement was left up to each state. And in New Jersey, from the very beginning, you can see 1790 up there, until nearly the end of the 20th century, we had 21 counties. And there was a senator from each county. Now, you may figure out that that was not too equal representation. For example, Atlantic City probably had maybe 100 people, while in the north, New Jersey, opposite from New York, say in Essex or Hudson County, had maybe 1,000 people, but each one had a senator. And that's the way it was until we decided to change it in 1965. So here we are within New Jersey, and we had our 21 districts that were based on the counties. And the red line indicates that there was something that happened in New Jersey before 1965 when we changed the way we selected our representatives for the legislature and became 40 districts and then had 12, now today have 12 districts for Congress. Congress was always pretty easy to come up with the districts because we were told how many we had based on the census. And there seemed to be an agreement that New Jersey was always sort of half Republican and half Democrat. And so it was only recently in modern times, that is in the 20th and 21st century, that we didn't have roughly equal districts, 7 and 6 for Democrats or Republicans, when we had 13 districts. So let's take a look at what happened when that red line in New Jersey in 1947 came into being, because it really changed New Jersey, but it didn't change redistricting until 20 years later. So just to do a little review, the new Constitution came about because New Jersey did not have a strong government until let's say when World War II took place and we needed a stronger government. So in 1947, right in the Rutgers gym, a Constitution Convention was held and created what the government that we have today. No longer a governor that held only a 3-year term that couldn't be repeated, but a CEO type governor and a limited cabinet that all reported to the governor. And we changed our justice system so that the state court was really in charge of administering all the courts and prisons in our state, which had also been the control of counties in the past. But what didn't happen, maybe by agreement, that the legislature was looked at and how we select our representatives or create districts. We just kept the counties. But it was soon after that time that you can see there were court decisions that both at the federal level as well as at the state level that really said we have to have, in effect, one person, one vote, equal population in the districts, in every district that is created to represent us in our governments. So we had another constitutional convention in New Jersey in 1965 when we finally said we have to do this a different way. No more counties with different populations having the same amount of representation in the Senate, and many different forms of selecting members of the Assembly, some at large, some from districts. And so finally, after the convention, an amendment to our Constitution was passed. But it wasn't until 1973 that that amendment was actually put into practice. And there are several trials at how we would do that. And we'll give you the heads up on 20 years later, we had a similar looking at the congressional districts. But for now, let's take a look and see what happened. Well, New Jersey is a reform state, believe it or not. The redistricting is done not by the legislature as it is in most states, but in New Jersey, that effort at creating districts was given to a commission. By the way, today there are 10 states that have a commission, as opposed to doing it in the legislature, where the party in power obviously has a strong hand in shaping the districts. So today, those 10 states that have a commission represent redistricting for about a quarter of the House of Representatives. That's a lot of people, while the states that are still doing the redistricting in the legislature, with the party in power having the most say, have about a half of the seats in under their jurisdiction. So you can see there's we have an opportunity to see what seems to work better, a commission or the states, or maybe it doesn't make any difference. That's something to be watched as we embark on redistricting for this next decade. So you saw what the Constitution of the United States says about redistricting. This is the section in the New Jersey Constitution that was adopted in 1965 that describes what happens with the Redistricting Commission for the legislature. Now, you don't have to read it, but just take a look at it. It fills up the page, but there's a double space. So then we had another not constitutional amendment to describe what happens with the congressional redistricting, and see how dense it is. Obviously, there's a lot more that's said about how to do the congressional redistricting than the legislative redistricting. But right now, we're focused on what's coming up, the legislative redistricting. So if you had to decide what you would want to know about a commission, look at this blank slate here. What would you want to know about the members, and what would you say should be their characteristics? Do you think it should be all members of the legislature, or all of the individuals involved being experienced in the legislature, or should it be people who are basically non-affiliated or have had experience in public service and public affairs? How many should there be? And how are they appointed? Who decides who does this really tremendously challenging job? And should there be a chair? And who should that person be? And what about the public? What kind of public engagement should there be? Should we think about redistricting as like a bill that comes before the legislature that has to have hearings or go through a committee first and then to the legislature as a whole? But those were the questions that faced New Jersey, obviously, when we decided we would have a commission and not leave it to the legislature. So let's take a look at what was decided about how the legislative commission, redistricting commission, would work. Okay, let's fill it in. Turns out there are 10 members, and 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, and they, as you can see, are appointed by each of the state party chairs. Republicans get 5, appointed by their chair, and the Democrats get 5, appointed by the chair of the Democratic Party, state Democratic Party. Now, there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about whether the legislators should be incumbents or not incumbents. And so we have had incumbent legislators participating and being designated by one of their party chairs to serve on that commission. It has been raised whether that's a conflict of interest. Then we asked the question of, well, what about the chair? Who chairs this 10-member body? And at this point, no one. But there is a provision for an 11th member to be appointed to the commission by the Chief Justice if the 10 members, actually the Democrats and the Republicans, agree that they can't agree. And so therefore they need someone else to provide a vote to adopt a plan. So we have a situation where if you have 11 members and you have to have a majority, you have to find 6 people to agree on a plan, and 5 people, many times, disagree. And the 11th member gets to be known as the tiebreaker here in New Jersey, but often plays the role as trying to organize the now 11-member body to try to come up with a compromise or to choose a plan that comes closest to what the commission has said it wants to achieve. Now, when it comes to public engagement, there was no provision made for the public to be involved in the new legislative commission. And the meetings are closed to the public. So if you have an expectation of what happens with a bill where there is some public engagement, or where there is a committee that makes a recommendation to the larger body, there really is no opportunity to have any formal public engagement. Now, in the most recent exercise of this, the commission did hold several public hearings, but there's been a lot of discussion currently. What does it mean to have public engagement? How should that be structured? What information should the public have? So that's what we have today. and that commission will be very quickly organized, but its decisions will not take place for this election that we have coming up for the legislature because of the lateness of the information from the census. And so you'll have to wait for another 2 years to find out how what will be decided very soon about the redistricting will play out when we have another election for the legislature. Okay, so that's what we did in 1965. That was our first effort at doing redistricting by commission form. So now what happened 20 years later when we again had a question to amend our Constitution? Here's what we agreed to then. Okay, now we're filling in the blanks. So you see that with the congressional redistricting, after having had some experience, it seems that's what happened. We now have 12 members, 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. But we will have 13 in total sitting together. What's happening first is that the 6 members from each party weren't just designated by the party chair, but we had more engagement in who selected those members. The party chairs got to pick 2 people, and the leaders in the legislature each got to pick one, the leader of the assembly and the leader of the minority leader, and then the president of the Senate and the majority leader each get to pick a person to serve on this commission. So that you can see there's maybe more engagement, although I think logic would tell us that the Republicans and the Democrats certainly discussed this together, the people who were having this responsibility, the 6 people who were having the responsibility. But this is where it gets interesting, because those members, those 12 members, meet, and they get to suggest who should be the chair and make that decision and give that decision to the Supreme Court. If they can agree, that person will probably be appointed the chair. If they disagree, then the Supreme Court does that selecting. That process is underway in New Jersey now, and we'll have to wait and see what happens with selecting that chair. But the chair is really a chair who organizes the committee, and there are requirements for people serving on this commission. They can't have been a sitting member or an employee of Congress, and the chair has a number of characteristics that make that person a more publicly oriented person. They can't have been involved in politics and have demonstrated their public interest. So we get to that point, and then we say, well, what about public engagement? So now public hearings are required, and a public meeting must be held to present the plan, although that is just a presentation. Nothing happens after that plan is before the public and the commission votes. So you can see that we've had some movement in the direction of what we're seeing today of wanting not just elected political leaders to make these decisions about redistricting. And we can come back to what we're seeing, because both on the legislative side as well as on the commission side, the 10 states that we now have operating by commission have had some other ideas of what it means to have public hearings, to be engaged with the public, and to have a commission that represents the public in terms of having people much more like the chair of the congressional redistricting involved in the process. We're still working, of course, with having to have a majority vote. One of the ways of dealing with that is to have a commission that might have a requirement to have a supermajority, so that rather than having a vote that is 7-6, it might be 8-5. And so that's another way that the process has been opened up. All right, so there we are, that's what we have. Now, what do they do? Well, every commission has to deal with equal population. That's probably the most important rule, that you have to come very close to the actual number that's required. And in the legislative districts, it's 240. In the congressional districts, I may not have that down to the last number, but the idea is that you have to have in every district an equal number. And you have to respect the voting rights in the U.S. Constitution. Today, there are some concerns about the weakening of the review process in certain states that have had voting rights not respected in the way the Constitution expects them to be respected. And that's been weakened. So that as we go into this redistricting, it's one of the issues that is coming up. Now, the other considerations for what the commission should do and how you might want to judge whether they're creating fair districts, interestingly enough, all start with C and are very difficult to actually measure. It is a more subjective than objective way of looking at how well the commission is serving the public. So a lot of it is related to geographic issues. Is there continuity? Can you get from one part of the district to another part of the district? You can't have another district inserted. How compact is it? Which is an interesting issue that's been tried to be described as round or square or not with funny extensions and so on. But as I will show you, New Jersey has a couple of districts that are not like that, but probably meet the community of interest consideration, which looks at the district itself. How much is it similar in its geography, its political background, even things like what gives it cohesion, like do the towns that are included in that district maybe have the same access to a regional newspaper, so you have a sharing of information. Today you might even think of where do they go shopping, or what is the central part of the district for bringing people together. Another consideration is to try to maintain the core of existing districts, because we want people to know what district they're in and not have dramatic changes in what towns are put together to create certain districts. And then another consideration is, will the result be competition among the parties? We here in New Jersey, in the legislative districts, have observed that there are very few competitive districts in the 40 in which our state is carved up for electing the legislature. And it's hard to define what is competitive, but if you say, do the winners of the election win by less than 10% margin, that means that it was probably pretty competitive. 15% maybe is another benchmark. But basically, in New Jersey, there are only about 3 to 6 of those 40 districts that meet that kind of a competitive test. So how much should the districts be competitive? If they're very competitive, then they would be changing from one party to the other, probably in every election. Is that a good thing? Should we have some kind of continuity? The work of the commission is tough. It's difficult to meet all of these standards and meet the equal population requirement. So you have to have some understanding of how hard this is to do this in a way that really does represent what we would consider fairness. And it's now something that's discussed at the federal level, at the state level. We hear an awful lot about it in the media because there is incredible interest in redistricting today. I just wanted to add that here are 2 districts in New Jersey. The 6th district over by the shore, and you'll see the little circled part where it's not quite connected. But I think we would agree that even though that is a district that looks like the kind of district that people say is gerrymandered, which is the next term that is going to be way big up on the screen, but it basically does meet a number of the characteristics of being a community of interest. Those communities in that lineup do have something in common. The same is true of the 13th Congressional District along the Hudson. So it's just an illustration that you have to really work at defining your terms and thinking creatively about both recommendations you might make and criticisms that you might make. But we do put a great deal of emphasis today on meeting community of interest, to have diverse districts, to represent communities that weren't represented before in terms of having an opportunity to enter into the election process, or to think about how we communicate, because knowing who your representative is and knowing who's running for election is a very important piece of making our representative democracy work. Okay, here we are, gerrymandering. It's really the big term. It's what everybody is talking about. And where does it come from? Well, remember I mentioned Elbridge Gerry early on, the big proponent of the Bill of Rights. Well, he went on to become the governor of Massachusetts. And as the story goes, he was carefully observing the redistricting process in his state, and obviously, because he wanted to be reelected, had great interest in seeing how the state was divided up, and apparently got in touch with the Redistricting Commission to suggest what would be a good district to make sure that he got reelected. And so where did the name come from? Well, you'll see the first part of it is his last name, and the last part of it comes from salamander, which is what a newspaper called the redistricting picture that he was suggesting, looking like a salamander. So that may be a strange way of calling something, but the fact that people are concerned about how and why districts are put together so that they're fair is the way we think about what gerrymandering is. Here's a definition that I think makes some sense. You can pick the actual word about how you think it's done, but gerrymandering is interfering, maybe deliberately manipulating or simply drawing or creating the boundaries of districts to enhance potential election prospects of particular political elections. Now that's a really nice, complicated, but sound, maybe dictionary definition, but there is a lot of concern in our country today that districts are not being drawn to be ultimately fair, however you describe that, but are being drawn to benefit one or the other parties or interests. And that's what we are seeing a lot of public engagement about. That's why you may be asked to actually think about redistricting as it begins here in New Jersey, but also, obviously, we're all concerned about what happens with districting that affects our Congress, our House of Representatives. And so as you think about what you would want, let's look at our little chart and see, well, what would be a reform if you wanted to think about what members you wanted to have doing the redistricting. A common reform is to include civic leaders, informed voters, and to expand the commission to include those kinds of people in the commission, or to have the commission be totally selected from nonpartisan or civically engaged people. You will see that how people get appointed varies greatly. California goes to great lengths to solicit self-nominations and nominations of individuals to serve on their redistricting body. Others rely on judges, people to be nominated, and some even include previously elected officials because of their experience. But it usually means making the commission be more representative of the population. And you can provide for that by not eliminating the people who are already designed to be on it, but to adding to the commission. And then thinking about the concept that I raised before, do you want it to just be by majority of vote that a new districting pattern is selected, or should there be a supermajority, which would mean that people who maybe are new to the process become more important because you have to consider their vote in order to adopt a plan. And then finally, public engagement has become much more of an active consideration, because trying out different district patterns using many computer programs and so on it makes it much easier to think about what the alternatives might be and to promote them and to discuss drafts in public. But that also means that the commission has to be open to hearing from people and being engaged with it, that there's a website that tells you what the commission is considering in terms of those districts that have less population or more population than 10 years ago, so that there can be a discussion about them. It requires a different kind of public engagement. So finally, this is not the end. We can look at other states, what they're doing. We can think about what New Jersey is doing. We can look at what many organizations who are engaged in raising our thinking and providing information are helping us understand what they think gerrymandering is, or how we can go about creating fairer districts that respect more interests and has more engagement for the public. So I hope this will spur you on to take an interest in what will be happening in our country, both for our national, federal government and for our state governments. We have changed in 10 years, so probably the districts too will change in 10 years.